true. Time cannot be spurred on like a horse, but it is not quite so slow as a pushcart. Gradually, the morning temperature attained its usual intensity. His eyeballs and brain began to seethe. The heat pierced his innards. His lungs burned. The moisture that the sand had absorbed during the night became vapor and was belched back into the atmosphere. The sand gave out a light which, through the refracted sunshine, made it seem like wet asphalt. Yet, basically, it remained the unadulterated 1/8 millimeter, drier than plain flour baked in a tin. Soon came the first sandslide. It was a noise he was used to, one that had become a part of the daily routine, but involuntarily he and the woman exchanged glances. What would be the consequences of having let the sand go for a day? While he did not think they would be serious, he was still worried. But the woman turned her eyes away in silence. Her sulky look gave the impression that he could worry alone as he pleased. He'd be damned if he'd asked her any more. Just when the sandslide seemed to thin out to a thread, it widened again to the size of a belt. It repeated the process by fits and starts, at length quietly ceased. It certainly did not seem serious enough to worry about. He heaved a sigh. The pulse pounded in his face and he felt a burning sensation. The thought of the cheap sake, which he had not tried to think about until then, suddenly began to draw his nerves to a point, like a flame floating in darkness. Anything would be all right. He wanted to moisten his throat. If he let things go on as they were, the blood in his body would dwindle away. He knew full well that he was sowing the seeds of his suffering, and that later he would regret it. But he could resist no longer. He took out the stopper, thrust the bottle to his lips, and drank. Yet his tongue, like a faithful watchdog surprised by an unexpected intruder, set up a howl. He choked. It was like sprinkling alcohol on a cut. None the less, he could not control a desire for a second, and even a third swallow. What horrible sake! Since the woman was there, he offered her some too. Of course she declined. Her refusal was as exaggerated as if he were forcing her to take poison. As he had feared, the alcohol in his stomach bounced to his head like a ping-pong ball, ringing like the buzz of a bee in his ears. His skin began to stiffen like pig's hide. His blood was spoiling. His blood was dying away. Can't you do anything? It must be hard enough for you, too. I loosened your ropes, so do something. All right, but if I don't get somebody from the village to bring water, well, why don't you get them to? I could, if we were just to start working. Don't be funny. Where do those fellows get the right to strike such an absurd bargain? Just tell me that. You can't, can you? They don't have the right, and you know it. The woman lowered her eyes and was silent. What a situation! The sky, visible above the door, had changed from blue to a glaring white, like the underside of a seashell. Granted, that obligation is a man's passport among his fellow men. Why did he have to get a permit from the villagers? Human life shouldn't be so many bits of paper scattered about. Life is a bound diary, and one first page is plenty for a book. There is no need to do one's duty for a page that is unrelated to the preceding ones. One can't get involved every time someone else is on the point of starvation. Damn it. He wanted water. But no matter how much he wanted water, he still did not have enough bodies to go around to all the funeral services of people who were of no consequence to him. A second sandslide began. The woman stood up and took down a broom for the wall. "You can't work. You promised, didn't you?" "No, no, it's for the mattresses." "The mattresses?" "If you don't get some sleep pretty soon." "If I get sleepy, I'll take care of them myself." He felt an earth-shaking shock and stood rooted to the ground. For a moment, everything seemed misty with sand that fell from the ceiling. The consequences of having stopped the shoveling were at last apparent. The sand, having no way out, was bearing down. The joints of the beams and uprights groaned in agony, but the woman, staring fixedly at an inner lintel, did not appear particularly concerned. The pressure still seemed to be only around the base of the house. Damn them! Do they really intend going on like this forever? His racing heart! It was hopping about like a frightened rabbit, as if unable to stay in its own hole. It seemed ready to crawl in anywhere. His mouth, his ears, or even into his bow. His spittle had become much more viscid, and the dryness in his throat was so bad. Perhaps it was because his thirst had not been adequately slaked by the cheap sake. As soon as the alcohol was dissipated, it would flare up again, and flames would reduce him to ashes. They must feel fine, doing such things. They don't have the brains of a mouse. Just what would they do if I died? The woman raised her face as if to say something, but, suddenly thinking better of it, maintained her unbroken silence. She apparently did not think it worthwhile to an answer at all. All right. If there was to be only one inevitable ending anyway, why didn't he try whatever he could? He gulped down another mouthful from the bottle of sake, and, bracing himself, hurried inside. He reeled back as if molten lead had struck his eyes. The sand, which spilled over into the hollows left by his feet, eddied in the whirlpools. Over there was surely the place he had attacked the woman and tied her up the night before. The shovel must surely be buried nearby. The sandslide had mostly stopped for a while, but even so, on the cliff towards the sea, the sand continued its ceaseless flow. From time to time, blown by the wind, it would drop from the face of the cliff, fluttering like a piece of cloth. Taking care not to start a slide, he fished around with the toes of one foot. Although he probed deeply, his foot met no resistance at all. The direct rays of the sun soon became unbearable. The pupils of his eyes were compressed to pinpoints, and his belly began to throb like a jellyfish. A violent pain pierced his forehead. He must not lose any more perspiration. This was the limit. He wondered what he could have done with the shovel. He had taken it out with the intention of using it as a weapon. That was certain. So it must be around. Peering closely at the surface of the ground, he was suddenly aware that at one point the sand was standing out in a ridge in the form of the shovel. He began to spit, but hastily stopped himself. He must retain in his body even the slightest bit of moisture. He separated the spittle from the sand between his teeth and his lips, and with the end of his finger scraped off only the portion that remained clinging to his teeth. The woman, facing the other way in the corner of the room, was doing something with the front of her kimono. Perhaps she was unloosening her waistband or brushing off the sand which had accumulated. He grasped the shovel halfway down the handle and brought it up to the level of his shoulders, aiming it at the wall that surrounded the earthen floor. Near the doorway, he heaved to with the cutting edge. The woman cried out behind him. He lunged with the shovel, bearing on it with all its weight. Disappointingly, it passed through the wall boards. They had the resistance of a wet cracker. Washed by the sand, they had seemed quite new from the outside, but it was apparent they had already begun to disintegrate. "What are you doing?" "I'm stripping the stuff off to make some material for a ladder." He experimented again at another spot. It was the same. Apparently the woman had been right when she said that the sand rotted the wood. If the part of the wall that was most exposed to the sun was like this, he could imagine what the rest would be like. It was remarkable that such a flabby house could be standing at all. It was bent and warped as if paralyzed on one side. Maybe such flimsy structures were dynamically possible, since they seemed to be making houses out of plastic and paper these days. But if that was the way it was with the boards, then he would try the crossbeams. "You can't do that! Stop! Please!" After all, we're going to be crushed by the sand anyway. Without paying any attention, he poised his arm to strike, but the woman, screaming, rushed violently at him. He put out his elbow and twisted his body in an effort to ward her off, but he had miscalculated, and instead of the woman he himself was swung around. Instantly he tried to counter, but she held on as if chained to the shovel. He did not understand. At least he could not be defeated by force. They rolled over 2 or 3 times, threshing about on the earthen floor, and for a brief moment he thought he had pinned her down, but with the handle of the shovel as a shield, she deftly flipped him over. Something was wrong with him. Maybe it was the sake he had drunk. Anyway, he no longer cared that his opponent was a woman. He jabbed his bended knee into her stomach. The woman cried out, and suddenly her strength ebbed. At once he rolled over on her and held her down. Her breasts were bare, and his hands slipped on skin that was slippery with sweat. Suddenly the two of them froze, as in a movie when the projector breaks down. It was a petrified moment that would go on and on if one of them did not do something. He could sense vividly the structure of her breasts outlined against his stomach, and his penis seemed like a living thing completely independent of him. He held his breath. With a slight turn of his body, the scramble for the shovel would turn into something different. The woman's gorge rose as she tried to swallow the saliva in her mouth. His penis received this as a signal to stir, but she interrupted in a husky voice. "City women are all pretty, aren't they?" City women? He was suddenly ashamed. The fever in his swollen member was abating. They seemed to have skirted the danger with good grace. He had not realized that soap opera could survive even in the midst of sand. Yet the average woman was firmly convinced, it seemed, that she could not make a man recognize her worth unless every time she opened her legs she did so as if it were a scene in a soap opera. But this very pathetic and innocent illusion, in fact, made women the victims of a one-sided spiritual rape. With his other woman, he had decided he would always use a condom. Even now, he was not convinced that he had been completely cured of the venereal disease he had once had. The results of the tests always came out negative, but after urinating, his urethra would suddenly begin to hurt, and when he checked a sample in a test tube, there would be, just as he had feared, something floating around in it, something resembling a piece of waste thread. The doctor had diagnosed it as a nervous disturbance, but he would not get rid of the suspicion that it was still the same old trouble. "Well, a rubber suits us pretty well, doesn't it?" Her small jaws and lips were covered with a thin skin. through which the blood seemed to be visible. She spoke with a certain calculated spite. "Between us, it's like buying at a department store, isn't it? If you don't like it, you can take it back any time. You make your mind up, looking at something wrapped up in plastic. You can look without breaking the seal. You wonder what's inside. You wonder if you can trust it. You wonder if you won't be sorry later if you buy the wrong thing now." But in her heart, she was probably not satisfied with such a commercial sample type of relationship. He remembered the brothel smell of disinfectant as he had begun buttoning up his trousers, already feeling he was hurried out. And the woman, still naked on the bed with the towel stuck between her legs. But it's all right if once in a while you feel like forcing a sale, isn't it? No, it isn't any forcing. But you're cured by now, aren't you? If you really think that, then why don't we agree to go on without protection? Come on now. Why are you trying to get out of your responsibilities? Well, didn't I say I don't like to force a sale? It's very strange. What have I got to do with your venereal disease? For heaven's sake. Maybe you do have something to do with it. Don't be silly. Well, anyway, I withdraw the forced selling. Well then, don't you ever intend to take off your hat in your whole life? I wonder why you're so uncooperative. It would be natural for you to feel tender toward me if we slept together. In other words, you've got a psychological venereal disease, haven't you? By the way, maybe I'll have to work tomorrow. Hmm, a psychological venereal disease, he thought, yawning. It's a pretty clever expression for her to think up, but she would never know just how much the expression had hurt him. In the first place, venereal disease was the exact opposite of soap opera. Venereal disease was the most desperate evidence that soap opera did not exist. Venereal disease, stealthily imported by Columbus in his tiny ships into tiny harbors, spread so diligently by everyone throughout the world. All men were equal before death and venereal disease. Venereal disease, the collective responsibility of mankind. Nevertheless, she absolutely refused to admit it. She had shut herself in her own Alice in Wonderland tale, where she herself played the main role, and he was left alone on this side of the mirror, suffering with his psychological venereal disease. And so his naked, hatless member was paralyzed and useless. Her mirror made him impotent. Her woman's innocence had turned him into an enemy. His face was as stiff as starch, his breathing like a storm. His saliva tasted of dry, scorched sugar, and such a terrible loss of energy. At least one glassful of water must have evaporated in perspiration. The woman arose sluggishly, keeping her head bent. Her sand-streaked face came to about the height of his eyes. Suddenly she blew her nose with her fingers and rubbed her hands with sand that she scooped up. Her trousers slipped down over her bending hips. Annoyed, he turned his eyes away. Yet it was not quite right to say he was only annoyed. A strange feeling, different from dryness, lingered on the tip of his tongue. His member had been pulsating and vibrant without the rubber, although only for a short time, until he had been put off by the woman's stupid expression. and now a lingering warmth remained in it. To call this a discovery would perhaps be exaggerating, but it was worth a moment's attention. He did not feel that he was particularly degenerate, but he was not at all disposed only to spiritual rape. It was like eating unsweetened tapioca. Spiritual rape meant that before he could hurt her, he would have to hurt himself. And why should he contract even a psychological venereal disease? That would be adding insult to injury. Was it true that a woman's glands were so weak that they emitted blood just because a man looked at her? He vaguely sensed that there were two kinds of sexual desire. For example, on the basis of the Mobius circle, when you courted a girl, you always began, it seemed, with lectures on nutrition and taste. That is, before you got around to sex. Food exists only in an abstract sense for anybody dying of hunger. There isn't any such thing as the taste of Kobe beef or Hiroshima oysters, but once one's belly is full, then one begins to discern differences in taste and textures. Sexual desire was the same. First came desire in general, and only after that did particular sexual tastes evolve. And sex couldn't be discussed in general. It depended on time and place. Sometimes you needed a dose of vitamins, sometimes a bowl of eels and rice. It was a well thought out theory, but regrettably, not a single girlfriend had offered herself to him in support of it. With the readiness to experience sexual desire in general, or sex in particular, that was natural. No man or woman is wooed by theory alone. He knew this, but he naively observed the theory of the Mobius circle, and kept repeatedly pushing the doorbell of an empty house, only because he did not want to commit spiritual rape. To be sure, he himself wasn't so romantic as to dream of pure sexual relations. You could do that when you were looking death in the eye, like the bamboo grass that bears seeds just as it is beginning to wither, like starving mice that repeatedly and frantically copulate as they migrate, like tuberculosis patients who are all seized by a kind of sex madness, like the king or ruler who dwells in a tower and devotes himself to establishing a harem, like the soldier for whom every moment is precious as he awaits the enemy attack, and who spends those final moments masturbating. Fortunately, however, man is not indiscriminately exposed to the dangers of death. Man no longer needs to fear even in winter. He has been able to free himself of the seasonal sexual urge. Yet, when the struggle is over, weapons become an encumbrance. Order has come about, and the power to control sex and brute force lies within man's grasp, in place of nature's. Thus, sexual intercourse is like a computation ticket. It has to be punched every time you use it. Of course, you must check to see that the ticket is genuine. But this checking is terribly onerous. It corresponds precisely to the complications of order. All kinds of certificates, contracts, licenses, ID cards, permits, certificates of title, authorizations, registrations, carrying permits, certificates of membership, letters of recommendation, notes, leases, temporary permits, agreements, income declarations, receipts, even certificates of ancestry. Every conceivable type of paper must be mobilized into action. Thanks to such checks, sex is completely buried under a mantle of certifications, like a basket worm. It would be all right, I suppose, if this were satisfying. But even so, would that be the end of certificates? Wouldn't there be something else we had forgotten to declare? Both men and women are captives of an oppressive jealousy, always suspicious that the other party has purposely left something out. To demonstrate their honesty, they are compelled to issue a new certificate. No one knows where it will ever stop. In the last analysis, the certificates seem to be infinite.